Welcome to this week's edition of Good Books Radio. Audiobooks.com is the chief underwriter for Good Books Radio, which is produced by UTRGV Media Services for Rio Grande Valley Public Radio. And now, here's your host, Dr. John Cook.
Welcome once again to another edition of Good Books Radio. I'm your host this week, Dr. John Cook, and with me today is Professor Robert Sutton. He's a Stanford University professor, and he's the author of 6 management books, including the New York Times bestseller, The No A-Hole Rule, and The Good Boss, Bad Boss. He's an IDEO fellow and co-founder of the Stanford Technology Ventures Program and Stanford Design Institute. He lives in Menlo Park, California. To learn more about his work, visit www.bobsutton.net. Dr. Sutton, welcome to the program.
Good morning. It's good to talk to you.
It's a really great book, and I'm sorry I have to edit the title. I like the title.
That's fine.
But expletive deleted. The A-Hole Survival Guide, How to Deal with People Who Treat You Like Dirt. Interesting, in the opening segment, you talk about a Google Scholar search on abusive supervision for 8 years, 2008 to 2016, returns 4910 scholarly articles and books on abusive customers, 282 on rudeness, 16,000 on incivility, 15,500 on bullying, 140,000 on workplace bullying, 11,800 on mobbing at work, and 2,900 on road rage, air rage, phone rage, verbal aggression, microaggression. Looks like there's a lot of people that have learned how to be difficult.
Yeah, a lot of people have learned how to be difficult, and a lot of academics have focused on looking at the effects of difficult people on us. So, yeah, the pile of evidence in the last 10 years that when we deal with people who treat us like dirt, essentially, it's bad for our mental health and our performance. The pile of evidence is just staggering. Mm-hmm. I just can't believe how much it's grown.
Yeah, you mentioned one of your colleagues says that that treating people like dirt can be a path to personal success.
Yeah, well, so that's my colleague Jeff Pfeffer, he's always a curmudgeon. The weight of the evidence, by the way, shows that treating people badly might help in the short term, but in the long term, you create a bunch of enemies and destroy the people who can help you. So there's a lot of evidence that it's bad for you. But the one time, perhaps, when treating people badly might work is if you're in a competitive zero-sum game where there's only one winner at the top. That might work, but the problem is that if you win the game, then you have damaged the people who can help you and alienated them. So the evidence is, for the most part, it's not worth it. And then the other argument I would make is that there's plenty of people who win by being civilized, and since it's not necessary, that if you're, I guess, a jerk or an a-hole and a winner in my book, you're still a loser because you've hurt so many people along the way. You can look at all sorts of people who are successful. Warren Buffett's a good example. He's actually a pretty civilized guy. Tim Cook, who replaced Steve Jobs, nobody seems to talk about what a civilized guy he is, and there's lots of other examples.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you mentioned the Netflix CEO, Reed Hastings, too, and also Robin Williams, which I was glad to see on the list of winners who treat people with respect.
Yeah. So Robin. I don't know did not know Robin Williams personally, but two things I know about him. Once, when I read the No A-Hole Rule, I asked the people in the studio, so who is like the nicest and nastiest people? I think I'll stay away from the nastiest for now, so I don't libel anybody unless I have to. But Robin Williams, his name kept coming up, and then also, so I had heart surgery about 12 years ago. And somebody in his office who knew somebody helped me make a decision. I ended up having heart surgery from the same surgeon he had in Cleveland. So the evidence I have sort of a little bit personally secondhand is that he seemed to be a pretty civilized guy, and he was successful. He had problems, but he was successful.
Mm-hmm. Let's talk about Chapter 2, How Bad is the Problem? We start off by looking at different kinds of dirty tricks that they have available to them, the a-holes do.
Yeah, so well, there's lots of different ways in which, if you will, that people who are jerks can make us feel bad. I kind of have been thinking about it in terms of 3 different ways. We tend to think of the sort of stereotypical jerk as somebody who yells at us or insults us or glares at us, and certainly dealing with somebody like that is difficult, and they can make us feel bad. But there's 2 other ways in which jerks do their dirty work, which are actually can be quite damaging. One is kind of the backstabber type. So this is the kind of person who smiles really nicely, but then stabs you in the back. That's difficult. And one of the worst kinds when I talk to people, and I think of the years when my wife was managing partner of a big law firm, that the people who are powerful, or at least think they're powerful, and treat each other or treat other people sort of like as if they're invisible, as if they're part of the furniture. Those sort of people also, that's another kind of nastiness. But on the whole, anything that people do that leaves others feeling consistently demeaned, de-energized, disrespected, that's the kind of behavior that we're talking about.
So you have there 6 questions, diagnostic questions, to make some decisions. The first is, have you got a problem? And I think that's an important one to ask, because it's not always a big deal when someone acts aggressive.
Yes. So sometimes it isn't a big deal, and I mean that's one of the things that I think is really important, is that a lot of times I might be in a situation where, something's bothering me, but it doesn't bother other people, and there's different sort of cultural norms about what is upsetting behavior. So I was just having a drink with a friend of mine. Her name's Kim Scott. She's also an author. And she was describing how the difference between she had led people in both Israel and Japan, and the difference between what would be upsetting behavior in Israel versus Japan is vastly different. So you've got to sort of figure out whether, number one, whether the behavior is objectively upsetting, and also whether it's actually hurting you, because some people are in situations that might upset somebody else, but it doesn't upset them at all. So that's sort of the first assessment, is essentially, are you suffering?
Great, and then there's a couple of other good points in here about how bad it is. But I'd like to look at a couple of the. You have 6 diagnostic questions, and a couple of them I'd like for you to make a point about. One is, how long will the ugliness persist?
Right. So that's really important. So, for example, for the research, we interviewed baristas at a place called Phil's Coffee out here in California, and it's tough being a barista, but if you've got a nasty customer, as one pointed out to us, like 4 minutes is a long time with a nasty customer at a place like Starbucks, for example. But if you've got a nasty boss or a nasty customer and you deal with that person day in, day out, then you probably have to do something more active, like getting out, perhaps fighting back. And so that's a really important distinction.
And then this, too, is an important question in my mind. Is it an individual or a systemic disease?
Oh, yeah, and so that's such a big one, because if you've just got, even if it's the most powerful person in the organization, if you've just got one person who's sort of the local bully, you can hide from them, you can sort of form a posse to fight back. But if you're in a situation where it's kind of like the Lord of the Flies, and everywhere you go, everybody treats one another like dirt. I actually just had I teach at Stanford, and one of my students came out of a workplace where she said everybody was nasty to everybody, and when you're in a situation like that, first of all, you're probably going to turn nasty yourself because it's contagious. Bad behavior is contagious. And the second thing is, she said, if you're in a Lord of the Flies situation, you actually have to bite back to defend yourself, or you're sort of helpless. So whether it's one or many is really important.
That notion of it being infectious is kind of scary to me. There's a contagion about mean-spirited behavior.
Oh, yeah, and positive behavior. That's the good news. And so there's 2 kind of mechanisms by which it spreads. One is there's a lot of evidence, and psychologists do this all the time, where if you put somebody in a room with a grumpy person, they become grumpy, and then they pass it on to someone else like a common cold. But also in organizations, there's this thing that Rosabeth Moss-Kanner from Harvard, she labeled it homosocial reproduction, which means that we hire people like ourselves. And the evidence is that not only do jerks want to hire jerks, they want to hire jerks who are a lot like them. So for example, narcissistic people like to hire narcissistic people. So you end up with both the behavior spreading and people hiring people just like them, and then you've kind of got this mess, if you will.
Yeah. And this is interesting because a lot of people believe what Vince Lombardi said. You quote him of saying, winners never quit and quitters never win, but you believe in quitting when it's appropriate.
Well, yeah, so I believe in persistence and pushing forward, But I also believe that there are some situations where the analogy is that if every day you go to work somebody hits you in the head with a hammer, maybe you should stop going to work. To put it in extreme relief. But the evidence on bad bosses, I did, as you said at the outset, I've done quite a bit of work on good versus bad bosses, and the evidence is that when people are bad bosses, both abusive and incompetent, that people quit, and it's better for their mental health, and it's also better for their performance when they quit. So you kind of got to do it.
Mm-hmm. And you talked about somebody referring to one place as an a-hole factory, and that there are boss holes
right,
who can be really difficult sometimes.
Yeah. So that guy was really interesting because that's sort of a classic guy who worked for, it's what he called an a-hole factory, where his boss was nasty to him, and there was this weird thing where his boss would steal and eat his food, like he'd be eating a bag of chips and he'd stick his hand in there and eat it. And the interesting thing is he described how he started turning nasty, having trouble with his partner and everything, and he hung on for 7 years thinking it was going to get better. But then when he finally quit and he went to a civilized place, he said, I couldn't believe that I stayed so much time there because my mental health got better, my relationships got better, I treat people at work in a civilized way. So that's somebody who should have probably quit earlier. And one thing just as a caveat that I'm really big on is, my motto is quit, but don't be stupid about it, because many of us need to pay our mortgage, support our children, and so on. And so I think that it's important to quit and to get out, but it's also important to protect yourself. And even people ask me, well, do I badmouth my former nasty company or nasty boss? And my reaction to that is, be a little bit careful. You might be discreet about it because you may be burning your bridges, so be careful.
Mm-hmm. Let's talk about some of the lies people tell themselves when they have a-hole blindness. Well, one of the classic sort of lies, and I tell myself this too, is it's going to get better, right? Mm-hmm. Yeah. So that's one of the classic things. It's going to get better. Well, sometimes it does get better, but if we go back to the guy in the a-hole factory, it actually I don't know why this is doing this. It actually didn't get better. It actually kept getting worse. Mm-hmm. So that's one of the things that you've got to do. Another thing that, and I tell myself this sometimes too, that I'll just do one more thing, and then I'll leave, and then suddenly it's 7 years later, and you're still there. Yeah, that I was going to highlight that one because I have done that. I'll leave for something better right after I finish this one more important thing, and then you never leave. So.
And then you never leave. Yeah, I can relate to that very well.
Let's see. There's a couple of other things about a clean getaway. You mentioned brief but dreadful encounters. And what do we do with those? Brief but
Well, when you have brief but dreadful encounters, I guess there's an argument that you want to get out as fast as you can. And there's also this notion that when they're really terrible, they can almost lead to PTSD. So you got to sort of be careful about that. But I guess my perspective about most brief but dreadful encounters, that in those situations that sort of reminding yourself that this is temporary, it's not my fault. Mm-hmm. When I look back on this in a couple of weeks or a couple of days, it will have been nothing. So in those situations, a lot of times thinking about the way it's going to feel in the future helps you get through it.
Mm-hmm. Well, we can't leave without talking about a very popular form of this, and that's cyberbullying.
Yeah. So one of the things that's interesting, and people sometimes ask me, so are we sort of at peak a-hole? And you can make kind of arguments either way. But if I was going to pick one thing that really has driven bad behavior, it's the notion of cyberbullying, the web. And one of the most interesting things is that we tend, a lot of times in the literature, to talk about trolls or strangers, but there's actually pretty good evidence that even people who we know well, when we interact with them in some way, especially in the web where we don't have eye contact with them and can't see how they respond to what we say or do to them, that we tend to be less empathetic and more nasty. And I actually just heard this from one of my students who works in an open office, big open office, kind of bullpen with about 80 or 90 people, and they use a collaboration software to work together. And she described how they will have flame wars where people are in the same room who don't get up to talk to one another. They just start attacking each other online, even though they're literally sitting in the same room.
Oh, my gosh.
So once you're in a situation where if there's any tension or any disagreement with people, and there's some way for you to meet with them in person as a human being and have eye contact, it's one of the best ways to if you will, to stop the nastiness. And, of course, with strangers, then I think if all of us had more control to block them, to not respond, to not get in those vicious circles, it would help a lot. But the thing that I've really been thinking about a lot lately, because some of my colleagues study this at Stanford, is this question of, well, what about people who we actually know, and what are the dangers of getting in arguments with them online?
Mm-hmm. And, you know, there was some research you cited from a Wall Street Journal reporter about a teacher who was being cyberbullied by a student, a woman cyberbullied by her neighbor, a man who received 500 nasty texts from an ex-girlfriend. It's like sometimes we know them really well, and yet we allow ourselves to be cyberbullied anyway. Yeah,
and that's in situations like that. I think the best is either if you can talk to them in person and sort of repair things, or if it's sort of crazy ex-boyfriend or crazy ex-girlfriend, I think that's where blocking and not responding is the first thing to do, rather than to get into that vicious circle.
Mm-hmm. And this is another interesting one, because I think so often we don't think of ever firing a client. But you mentioned that sometimes, I mean, even though financial consideration should affect which customers and clients you fire, I mean, there are times when firing the client is in your best interest.
It's absolutely in your best interest. Well, first of all, if it's a big client like a consulting firm or a law firm, there becomes a point where they do so much damage, where they hurt your best people, they drive out your best people, that although on first look it seems like a good idea to keep the money coming in, but in the end you're sort of damaging your people and even damaging your brand. And there's also some research that shows that little sort of field studies that when we go into restaurants, places like that, and we see nasty customers, that it actually drives away other customers, not just employees. So there's this contagion effect where it can hurt your brand. So as a result, both airlines and now restaurants, because there's reservation software such as OpenTable, they will figure out people who HWC, that means handle with care, or airlines like JetBlue and Southwest Airlines have for many years had sort of do not fly list, and this is not for terrorists, it's for people who are so damaging and so rude that they don't want them, if you will, using their services. And I do think that sometimes it is for the greater good to protect both your employees and also to protect your brand too.
Yeah, interesting. The study of the University of Chicago, a psychologist and some of his colleagues compared adolescents with aggressive conduct disorder. They did brain scans and found out that some a-holes take a kind of pleasure in your pain.
Right. So one of my mottos also is know your a-hole, and one of the classic kind. This is kind of Machiavellian personality. These are people who literally, as you say, your pain is their pleasure, and it is interesting. There's long-term studies in Scandinavia, especially Norway, that show that kids who were school bullies tend to become adults who bully people in the workplace and other parts of life in that way, because it gives them pleasure. And if you are dealing with that sort of bully as opposed to one who's more clueless or more self-absorbed, somebody who is truly taking, if you will, pleasure from your pain, then if you can't get away from them, that's the kind of person you probably have to bite back at, because when they see signs of collaboration or cooperation, it's just a sign of weakness. So, as I say, your main choices are to get out, fight, or to fight back, and being nice to them is not a good strategy.
One mechanism for helping yourself temporarily is something you call safety zones. So nurses' lounges and backstage and even restrooms can be a place to kind of recover and compose yourself.
Yeah, so I've got a lot of strategies in the book to kind of avoid or limit your exposure to, if you will, the nasty people in your life. And as you say, there's a whole body of research about places where people can escape from the unpleasantness of their clients, of nasty people at work, and to sort of recover and provide each other social support. And the example I talk about in the book was when I was in graduate school, one of my colleagues, Dan Dennison, and I did a ethnography of nurses, and we would see this really open sexual harassment going on. And what they would do is they would go into the nurses' lounge, and this is a gendered thing too, where the male surgeons were harassing the female nurses. They would go into the nurses' lounge, and the basic rule was you were not allowed in the nurses' lounge if you were not a nurse, and that's where they would sort of recover. And that's one of the things that we sort of all need in life is to have a little bit of time to compose ourselves, so we can, if you will, go back and steel ourselves for the difficulties ahead.
Mm-hmm. I used to do a seminar called Coping with Difficult People, and there were more nurses than any other profession that signed up for that course. So, well,
I mean, it is interesting. You think about occupations. I mean, everybody's bullying them. They've got patients. They've got the administration. They got doctors. They've got patients' families, the insurance companies. It's just amazing. Being a nurse is a nurse and a flight attendant, two of the toughest occupations.
Yeah, I think so too. Let's talk about some mind tricks, because if we're going to get some tools in our toolkit, right. One of them that's really powerful is reframing.
Right. So some of your listeners will probably have heard of cognitive behavioral therapy, and so a lot of my ideas are sort of inspired by cognitive behavioral therapy. That sometimes we all get in situations we can't change, so maybe we can define the situation so it doesn't hurt us so much. So one way is to kind of depersonalize it. So is one actually therapist wrote me, what I tell people in the place where I work is that if they're an a-hole, it's just an a-hole doing a-hole things. It isn't about you. So that's sort of a depersonalization strategy. Sometimes laughing at them, seeing the humor in it can help you sort of depersonalize, sort of see them as comedians. One of my favorite and one there's actually quite good evidence for, is this thing that's called temporal distancing. And what temporal distancing is, it means that when you're in the moment and you're sort of feeling the pain of the jerk in front of you, what you do is you imagine it's a year, 2, 3 years later, or maybe even just a week later, and you're looking back on it and it doesn't hurt so much. And so a good example, one guy wrote me, was he described how when he was in the Air Force Academy, and he would be, they get hazed, they get sort of yelled at kind of every day. His first year, he said he'd say, I'd imagine it's 3 years later and I'm flying my plane, because he was going to the Air Force Academy to fly, and I'm looking back on it and it just didn't hurt so much. Mm-hmm. I thought that was pretty cool.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I like the notion of looking back from the future. I had a secretary who said, 100 years from now, this won't matter at all. It hardly matters now.
That's pretty good. I like that. I like her attitude. The use of humor is one I didn't want to miss out on. A lot of people give their a-hole nicknames like board hole, boss hole, right. Darth Vader, not mentor but tormentor, sea witch, and I can remember in a movie one character referred to her stepmother as step monster. And that sort of thing seems to be useful in just like engaging humor. Yeah. So what it does is so there's lots of research on humor. It's a little bit dangerous too, because it can be used as an insult delivery system. Mm-hmm. But as a defense mechanism, it's actually quite useful to laugh at people, because it does a couple of things. One, they seem less threatening, and the other thing is it kind of releases the tension. And then when you get together with your colleagues and you laugh about the sea witch or whatever, it creates a sort of bond, so you feel protected among the people that you're with. So there's a whole bunch of advantages to humor, especially jokes that you share with your colleagues and fellow victims, if you will.
Mm-hmm. Non-defensive responses was something that I've found useful and actually taught in coping classes in coping with bullying. Just saying non-committal things like, I'll take that into consideration, or I've never looked at it that way, and just comments that don't actually agree with the tormentor but do acknowledge that they said something.
acknowledge that they said something, and sometimes it's unfortunate that people have to do this, but sometimes we get in situations, it's kind of the walking on eggshells situation, where you realize that the best thing to do to get through at least a short-term interaction is not to set them off, because when somebody's really volatile, you kind of be careful about sort of setting them off. And in some ways, and this is something that I've talked about in other parts of my research too, that I always sort of say that there's lots of times in society when people talk about being exciting and passionate and noticeable, but sometimes being boring and invisible has all sorts of advantages, including not being noticed by that bully who might go after you if they notice you. That, by the way, is one of the things that, and I talk about this in the book, that the people who screen us from TSA at the airport, they get really good at being invisible and not noticed because they get yelled at so much during the course of the day. So that's one of the kind of things that there's some research on that, about how being there but invisible is sort of the art of being a TSA agent or officer who doesn't get yelled at too much.
In the chapter on fighting back, because I want us to touch on this so that people will know how great this book is, you say that when a problem turns ugly, you may feel agitated and want to take that jerk down right now, but that's usually not a great idea.
No, and I think that we've all been there. That we want to take them down right now, and to me, it's sort of like quitting, which is that I believe in if possible, fighting and bringing down your tormentor if you can, but you kind of got to be smart and figure out, well, how much power do I have in this situation? What are my options if I lose? And then how good is my documentation? And so anything you can do to sort of slow down and take a few minutes and perhaps talk with friends and even fellow victims about what are we going to do so that we can both protect ourselves and perhaps fight back. And one of the most important things in terms of slowing down, and there's increasing evidence about this, and you even can see this with a lot of things in the news, everything from Harvey Weinstein to Bill Cosby to Travis at Uber recently out where I am, is that when you're alone and you're trying to fight a bully, it's actually quite difficult. But when more people come forward and they're on your side, then first of all, you have more evidence, and second of all, people are less likely to think that you're just sort of a lone nut who's overreacting to this jerk. So there's a bunch of things that take a little bit more time that will increase the odds that you can at least protect yourself and hopefully win against the people or person who's oppressing you.
Yeah, and I don't want to lose that D-word, documentation. I actually was reading this book when I was having a problem, and I've actually been doing more careful documentation with one particular problem person lately. So it's a good piece of advice.
And documentation really does help, because otherwise you're in this he said, she said situation, and anything you do to save the emails. One of my favorite examples was years ago, a woman wrote me, she was a dog catcher, she was an animal control officer, and they had these really, really racist, nasty coworker, and they go to the boss and complain and nothing would happen. So she and her colleagues, they put together what they called the A-hole diaries, and just for a couple of weeks they just wrote down all of the different nasty behaviors their coworkers did, and they brought their A-hole diaries to their boss, and magically their nasty coworkers sort of disappeared a few days later. And it doesn't always turn out that well, but it certainly improves your chances of winning if you can have if you will, a case against the people who are being so nasty to you.
Well, there's a couple of stories in here, and you make it clear that you don't recommend revenge because long-term it's not a good idea. But I love the story about the gate agent who was being abused by the passenger in front of you so much, and she got to you next, and she said, he's going to L.A., but his bags are going to Nairobi.
So this story actually came to me from Jason Zweig, who writes a personal finance column at the Wall Street Journal. But I met him a few years ago, and he told me the story, and then he sent it. But literally, he's in line at Kennedy Airport, and he's just amazed at how well this gate agent is taking this abuse. And as you say, he gets up and he said to the woman, he says, "How did you take that?" And she just smiled and said, as you say, he's going to Los Angeles and his luggage is going to Nairobi. In little things like that, I think they're kind of good in the short term and they give you the feeling of control. But the two problems with revenge, as you imply, is the first problem is that very often it doesn't change the situation at all. Sometimes if it's the kind of revenge that does bring down the person, then that might be a little bit better. And the other problem with thinking about revenge and engaging in revenge, and this is research sort of on forgiveness too, is if you're constantly thinking about how angry you are at the person, it's like they're winning, you're not letting go of it. And in fact, there's related research on kids who were bullied in high school and in grade school, that the ones who forgive and don't remain anger and don't remain obsessed with getting revenge, they're the ones who recover more quickly than the ones who are just sort of obsessed with it the rest of their life.
This is such a fun book, and I think there's some other great techniques in there, like calm and rational confrontation and other things that people need to know about. And so I think this is a must-read, and I'm going to say it once for the FCC the right way. This is Dr. Robert Sutton, and the book is The Asshole Survival Guide, How to Deal with People Who Treat You Like Dirt. Dr. Sutton, it's been a great pleasure. I appreciate the time. I remind our listeners that if you do not hear our regularly scheduled broadcast, you can catch us on our YouTube channel, Good Books Radio, Strong and Cook. I'm your host, Dr. John Cook. Thanks for listening.